Hey everyone. So you've been following this whole proposed U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal thing, and it's a lot to process, right? So many different angles. You've given us a whole bunch of articles to go through, and we're really going to deep dive into it and try to figure out like what's really going on here. We're going to break down the proposed deal itself, Zelensky's resistance to it, Trump's insistence on getting paid back, and ultimately, what does this mean for Ukraine's future as a nation? That's the big question, right? And to help us kind of connect all these dots, we've got our expert here who's like amazing at seeing the bigger picture. So ready to dive in.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so this deal at its heart, it's basically U.S. wanting access to Ukraine's resources. In exchange for financial aid, we're talking rare earth minerals, which are hugely important for technology, oil, gas infrastructure, even ports.
Yeah, and it's important to understand the scale of what's being asked here. Initially, the U.S. proposed a 50-50 split of Ukraine's natural resource revenue.
50%, that's a pretty big chunk.
It is, but then they shifted gears
Huh.
and demanded Ukraine contribute to a fund until it reaches, wait for it, $500 billion.
$500 billion. I mean, just to put that in perspective for you, that is more than twice the entire value of Ukraine's economic output in 2021, before the war even started.
Right, and you can understand why Zelensky is pushing back so hard, especially on this financial side of things. I mean, he's been quoted saying, I am not signing something that 10 generations of Ukrainians will have to repay.
Yeah, I can't really blame him for that. It's like asking someone to mortgage their future, their children's future, their grandchildren's future.
It's a lot to ask, yeah, and if you actually do the math, using Ukraine's projected natural resource revenue, it might take them something like 250 years to pay off that $500 billion.
250 years, that's practically an eternity. And there's more. The deal also includes this thing where for every dollar of U.S. aid Ukraine receives, they'd have to pay back $2.
Yeah, essentially it's a 100% loan, as Zelensky very aptly put it.
So we've got a huge financial burden, no question. But what's even more alarming to me is that this proposed deal doesn't include any security guarantees for Ukraine against Russia.
That's right, and this is a major sticking point for Zelensky. I mean, he's leading a country that's fighting for its very existence, and this deal would leave them incredibly vulnerable.
So he's being asked to hand over a huge chunk of Ukraine's resources without any real promise of protection in return. It just seems, I don't know, like a recipe for further instability almost.
Yeah, it definitely raises some serious questions about the long-term implications for Ukraine's security, and that's why Zelensky's been working on a different strategy, trying to rally European support.
Right. There's that European summit coming up that's going to focus on military aid and security guarantees for Ukraine.
Exactly. He's trying to build a coalition, a united front to back Ukraine's war effort, and potentially counter these demands from the U.S.
It's interesting to see him navigating this whole thing. I mean, he even made that tongue-in-cheek offer to step down if Ukraine was allowed into NATO, knowing full well that both Trump and Putin oppose Ukraine joining NATO.
Right. It was a really smart move. He cleverly highlighted the importance of those security guarantees without directly confronting either leader.
Very strategic. It really underscores his message that Ukraine must be a part of any peace negotiations with Russia.
Absolutely. He's making it very clear that he won't let Ukraine's fate be decided by others.
Okay, so we've got the deal itself. We've got Zelensky's response to it. Let's turn to the other major player here, Donald Trump. He's been pretty straightforward about it, saying we're going to get our money back from Ukraine.
Yeah, no mincing words there. He's been very clear about wanting to see a return on the aid that the U.S. has given to Ukraine.
And not just any return. He specifically mentioned we're asking for rare earth and oil, anything we can get.
Right, and it's important to understand his perspective here. He's coming at this from a very business-oriented mindset. He sees it as recouping investments.
So the White House is arguing that by having American companies have economic interest in Ukraine, that would deter future Russian aggression.
That's the theory, at least. The idea is that if you have American companies invested in Ukraine, Russia would think twice before launching another attack.
But Zelensky has a counterpoint to that, doesn't he? He's pointed out that U.S. company already had a presence in eastern Ukraine before the war, and that didn't stop Russia from invading.
Yeah, that's a valid point. It does raise some questions about the effectiveness of economic deterrence as a strategy, especially in this context.
And then you add on top of that this kind of growing mistrust between Zelensky and Trump.
Yeah, that's not helping the situation. Trump has even echoed some Kremlin talking points and questions Zelensky's legitimacy as a leader.
Wow. So we've got this proposed deal, strong pushback from Zelensky, and a U.S. president who seems determined to get his money back, regardless of the wider implications.
It's definitely a very complex and volatile situation, and we haven't even really begun to unpack the potential consequences for Ukraine's sovereignty and future.
And that is where we're headed next. You ready to dive a little deeper?
Absolutely. There's a lot more to uncover here. We've been really digging into this proposed minerals deal and its potential impact on Ukraine, but I think it's important to step back for a moment and think about what is the U.S. endgame here? Why this big push for this deal, even with Zelensky resisting so strongly?
Right. It seems like it goes beyond just getting paid back, right? Like there's a bigger picture we need to consider.
Exactly. And some analysts believe that this minerals deal might actually just be one piece of a larger strategy by the Trump administration.
Interesting. So what kind of strategy are we talking about here?
Well, remember, Trump has been pretty vocal about wanting to broker a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. He's even had those direct meetings with Russian officials.
So is it possible then that this minerals deal is kind of a bargaining chip, a way to incentivize both sides to come to the table and make some concessions?
That's one theory. It's like he's trying to sweeten the deal for everyone involved. Access to valuable resources for the U.S. financial aid for Ukraine, and an end to the war for both sides.
I mean, yeah, on the surface, it kind of sounds like a win-win-win. But is it really that simple? Are there potential downsides to this approach?
Oh, definitely. We have to think about the sustainability of a peace agreement that's brokered under these conditions. Would it actually address those root causes of the conflict, or would it just be kind of papering over the cracks?
So are you saying it's possible that a deal made under this kind of duress, with major concessions from Ukraine, but without really addressing those underlying motivations, could actually lead to more conflict down the line?
Exactly. And then there's the impact on Ukrainian sovereignty. If they become so heavily reliant on U.S. financial support, will they really have the freedom to make their own decisions, or will they always be looking over their shoulder?
It's a tough spot for Zelensky. He's trying to secure peace and rebuild his country, but not at the cost of its independence and future.
He's absolutely caught between a rock and a hard place, facing pressure from both the U.S. and Russia, each with their own agendas.
It's almost like he's playing this high-stakes game of chess, trying to anticipate everyone's moves and protect Ukraine's interests.
That's a great analogy, and the stakes couldn't be higher. I mean, we're talking about the future of Ukraine and potentially the balance of power in the entire region.
So for our listener who's been following this story, what are the key takeaways? What should they be paying attention to as this whole situation unfolds?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this situation is far more complex than it might seem on the surface. It's not just about minerals. It's not just about money. It's about power dynamics, strategic interests, and the survival of a nation.
And it's important to be aware of all the different perspectives. We've got Zelensky fighting for his country, Trump focused on his deal-making approach, and Russia looming large in the background.
Exactly. Don't just take any one narrative at face value. Look for those nuances, the things that might be overlooked in all the headlines.
And I think as we move forward, it's just so vital to stay informed and engaged. These decisions will have a ripple effect, not just within Ukraine, but across the globe.
Absolutely, the world is watching, and the potential consequences are huge.
So I think for our listener, the biggest question becomes, what role should the U.S. play in all of this?
Right. Is it about securing their own interests, or is it about genuinely supporting Ukraine in building a secure and prosperous future? And what responsibility does the international community have in supporting Ukraine's recovery?
Tough questions with no easy answers.
But they are questions worth thinking about.
So we've covered a lot of ground here exploring this proposed minerals deal, the motivations of all the players involved, and that potential impact on Ukraine's future. But before we wrap things up, there's one final thought I want to leave you with. It's kind of provocative.
Ooh, I like a good cliffhanger. Lay it on me.
Okay, so we've been focusing a lot on what Ukraine stands to gain or lose from this whole deal. But what about the other side of that coin? What are the potential risks and rewards for the U.S. in all of this?
That's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in the immediate situation and overlook those long-term implications for everyone involved.
Right. So is this purely a transactional arrangement for the U.S., just a way to secure those valuable resources? Or is there a deeper strategic play at work here?
Could it be part of a bigger effort to reshape the geopolitical landscape, maybe even at the expense of Ukraine's long-term interests?
Those are some heavy questions, and I think they're worth considering as you continue to follow this story. Because the answers could have really far-reaching implications, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire region.
Right. It's a reminder that in international relations, there are rarely any simple solutions or clear-cut good guys and bad guys.
It's a real-world geopolitical thriller unfolding.
And it definitely keeps us on our toes.
So for our listener, the key takeaway here is stay engaged, stay informed, and form your own opinions. Because the future of Ukraine, and potentially even the balance of global power, could very well depend on it.
Well said. The decisions that are made in the coming days and weeks will have ripple effects that are felt around the world, It's a reminder that even events that seem far away can have a profound impact on our lives.
And that's why I think these deep dives are so important. Understand the connections, the motivations, the potential consequences.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter.
And as always, thanks for joining us
On this journey of discovery. Okay, so we've been trying to unpack this whole U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal. And it's complicated, right? It's constantly changing and has these huge global implications.
Yeah, it really does feel like trying to predict the weather in a hurricane, like there's all this swirly energy, but it's almost impossible to get a clear forecast.
Exactly. And that's why we've really focused on trying to give you the tools to analyze this situation, not just like tell you what to think about it.
Right. We've looked at the framework of the deal itself, Zelensky's resistance to it, Trump's motivations, and even the possibility of those hidden agendas. On both sides,
But I think the really tricky part is, what happens next?
this is where critical thinking is so important. You can't just accept any single narrative. You have to look for those subtle signs, those details that might get missed in all the rush of headlines.
Like Zelensky, for instance, is walking a real tightrope here. He's got pressure from the U.S. pushing for this deal, but he's also trying to secure support from Europe, who might have a totally different perspective.
And we're still missing some key pieces of the puzzle, like those peace negotiations between the U.S. and Russia. What are the actual specifics there? What concessions are being considered?
And what about the role of Europe in all of this? I mean, Zelensky's clearly trying to strengthen that alliance, but how much influence can they really have on the U.S. and Russia?
These are the questions that are going to shape the future of this conflict and ultimately determine the fate of Ukraine.
So as you keep following this story, here's what I want you to keep in mind. Pay attention to the details. Question those narratives that are being presented. And don't be afraid to draw your own conclusions.
Because in a situation as complex as this one, there are very rarely easy answers or clear-cut good guys and bad guys.
This is a real-world geopolitical thriller unfolding.
And it certainly keeps us on our toes.
So for our listener, I think the biggest takeaway here is stay engaged, stay informed, and form your own opinions. Because the future of Ukraine, and maybe even the balance of global power, could really depend on it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The decisions that get made in the coming days and weeks, they're going to have these ripple effects that are felt all over the world. It's a good reminder that even events that seem far away can have a huge impact on all of our lives.
And that's why we do these deep dives, to understand those connections, the motivations, the potential consequences.
Couldn't agree more.
So until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter
Thanks for joining us
on this journey.